Good afternoon. It's been 3 years, and it seems like a lifetime since we last gathered in this sacred space for our beloved summer rite. I don't think I've ever been happier to say these blessed words. Welcome back to the Hutchins Forum on the lovely island of Martha's Vineyard. Since our last convening here, we've elected a president, whether half the country agrees or not. We've seen Black voters in Georgia tip the balance of power in the United States Senate, even if it doesn't feel like it. We've seen a vicious assault on the United States Capitol that included the waving of a Confederate flag in the rotunda and heroic actions of Capitol Police, including Black officers like Eugene Goodman, repelling the mob at tremendous personal peril. We've also seen the former Confederate state of Florida replace a white supremacist statue in National Statuary Hall with that of Mary McLeod Bethune, the very first African-American and one of the few women to be immortalized in that commemorative space, adjacent to the same rotunda that was defaced on January 6, 2021. Let's keep in mind that Dr. Bethune now represents a state whose governor has rather energetically led the charge in passing a law silencing the teaching of the complicated history of race in the state's public schools under the banner of the cultural rights social science fiction monster, which they call something that they define as critical race theory, to borrow a concept from the late, great, endlessly signifying novelist Albert Murray. We've seen the brutal murder of George Floyd and too many others, along with the senseless and seemingly pervasive killing of our children with guns in streets and schools across America. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a boiling time in America, and not just because of climate change. How did the challenges of our democracy become so great? And our capacity to meet and overcome those challenges, it seems sometimes, so drained of effectiveness, of unity, of hope. We endured a traumatic pandemic that doesn't want to let go of us, even if we're ready to move on from it. The pandemic has affected Black and brown communities disproportionately, exposing structural inequalities that literally are a matter of life and death. Too many among us have suffered and lost loved ones, lost their health, lost their security, and lost their peace of mind in these years of suffering. But we are also determined to find new ways of being and working in the world without losing our foundations of faith and community. Since we last met together here at the old Whaling Church, we've also witnessed a tremendous unleashing of talent, creativity, and opportunity in Black America. We have the very first Black female Vice President, Kamala Harris. And just as important, the very first Black female United States Supreme Court Justice. Ketanji Brown Jackson. Kizzmekia Corbett, a Black woman scientist, led the team at the NIH that helped to develop and evaluate the Moderna vaccine. Harvard's own Amanda Gorman. Delivered a stirring poem at President Biden's inauguration in 2021. When Broadway reopened last summer, it was fueled by a rising generation of Black playwrights. Black professional athletes from the NFL to the NBA to the WNBA let their voices be heard that indeed Black lives matter and that Brittany Griner should be released immediately from the insanity of that unjust imprisonment she's being forced to suffer. Posthumous painting by Jean-Michel Basquiat, recently sold for $82 million. And we're living through what is truly a renaissance in Black art and Black literature, not only here in the United States, but throughout the diaspora. But ladies and gentlemen, we're also living in a time of alarm, when a new phase of the culture wars, Black and white, are increasingly angry and more extreme and tribal than ever before. Consider this irony. Back in the 1990s, we were all using our energies trying to get Zora Neale Hurston included in the North. Her work could accessibly be taught in high school and college classrooms. Now we're trying to prevent Hurston and many other writers of color, feminists, and gay authors from being banned from those same public school classrooms. Freedoms taken for granted for half a century are being rolled back by a winner-take-all Supreme Court, with more rights on the chopping block, threatening the equal rights of women, same-sex couples, and everyone in the privacy of their bedrooms. Perhaps the greatest threats of this court to Black Americans are voter suppression, the same tool that was used to upend Reconstruction, and affirmative action, which has done so much to diversify historically white and male institutions like Yale, where I was a student, and Harvard, where I teach. And while gun sales are up, the right to be free from the threat of those guns is under assault. And at every turn, there is a war over wokeness, intolerance, political party affiliation, the outcome of elections, and the freedom to write, express, and bear witness to the truths we are living every day. Let us never forget, political efforts to ban or restrict the public discourse about any topic are incompatible with the tenets of free thought. What we stand for as a nation, today as in previous years, is tested by our capacity to countenance voices of dissent. Anthony Appiah, one of our foremost thinkers on ethics and philosophy, wrote the following words, which I happen to keep posted on my refrigerator to remind me daily of their saliency and of their truth. And I quote, "Despite the forces that would keep us socially and even geographically isolated from one another, you each have a reason to try to understand the other tribe, to figure out what its members believe, and to the extent that there are arguments involved, why they believe it. Democracy falters," Appiah continues, "not when we disagree about things, but when we lose interest in trying to make sense of the other person's point of view and in trying to persuade that person of the merits of our own point of view. When we stop talking even to people we know and like because of political disagreements, we've abandoned the deliberative democratic project of governing the republic together," unquote. I'll quote another writer whose courage I admire and whose words bear in every way on what we'll be discussing today. And I quote, "Just what is freedom of expression? Without the freedom to offend, it ceases to exist," unquote. The writer who said that is none other than Salman Rushdie. The brutal attack on him just 2 weeks ago reminds us that the culture wars are not new, nor are they uniquely American, but they are always and everywhere real and, sadly, potentially deadly. Censorship is to art and expression, ladies and gentlemen, as lynching is to justice. We absolutely must meet this moment with steadfastness and with resolve. My friends, this is where we come in. Convenings such as this are core to the DNA of the Hutchins Center and this tradition of creating a forum unabashedly and most enthusiastically devoted to the freedom to speak the truth vigorously, peacefully, and with the blessing is a credit to our moderator, Charlene Hunter-Galt. Give it up to Charlene. It is a credit to our panelists, whom she'll introduce, and most especially to my dear friends Glenn and Debbie Hutchins, who make it possible through their continuing generosity. Glenn and Debbie are, without exaggeration, the most generous funders of research and programming in African American studies since the field was established 50 years ago. Their visionary philanthropy, give it up for Glenn and Debbie. Their visionary philanthropy and wise counsel facilitate some of the most exciting research about race occurring anywhere in the Academy today. And for that, my colleagues and I are deeply thankful. There are other people I'd like to thank too. The members of our National Advisory Board, whose continuing support makes possible all that we do at the Hutchins Center. And I'm going to list their names, and when I do, please stand up. Carol Bionde, Richard Cohen, Burgess Colbert, Jeremy Henderson, Mitch Kapor, and Frida Kapor Klein, who are represented today by Dr. Allison Scott, the CEO of Kapor Center, Christina Weiss-Lurie, Peter Schwabach, Melissa Vale, Davis Weinstock. Please give it up for members of our board. I would like to take a moment to mention a dear friend and board member who passed away this summer, Nancy Garvey. Nancy leaves her two beautiful children and a legacy of transformative contributions to education, leadership, business, and the arts, a yearly presence at this very event, who lit up any room she was in. Nancy will be greatly missed by all who had the good fortune to know her. We're blessed at the Hutchins Center to have the best staff in the world. And none of this today would happen without their tireless efforts, led by Dr. Abby Wolf, who couldn't be with us today, but who's watching, and with special gratitude to Amy Gosdanian, Justin Sneed, Matt Weinberg, and Dr. Kevin Burke. Please give it up for our staff. And now it is my great pleasure to turn things over to my sister and collaborator, Charlene Hunter-Gull, who has so masterfully navigated us through the exciting exchanges that have characterized the dialogue at the Hutchins Forum since the day she stepped to the mic. Please give it up for Charlene Hunter-Gull.
Well, thank you, Skip, I guess, because you promised me you weren't going to preach before we got to our panel. But preaching you did, and you helped to lay out our theme for today. And I am just absolutely thrilled to be with people in the flesh, because I enjoyed doing it on Zoom, but I like looking at you, and I couldn't see you on Zoom. So it's very nice to have you back in this wonderful edifice. As Skip just indicated in so many words, happy is not a word I have heard often these days, unless I was home with my husband, who sometimes is happy. But these are really challenging times, as Skip has just indicated. Not just challenged by the pandemic, but also challenged about fierce disagreements over what can be properly taught in our classrooms to our young people, especially about race. And so our goal today is to examine what is now known as the culture wars, the topic of which brought you here, right? And what, if anything, we can do to help us create a more perfect union, not to mention a unified union, dare I say, if at all possible. And so I'm only going to introduce our panelists briefly, since you have their more extensive and, dare I say, impressive bios in the program. So if you want to know more about them, get your programs or go online and look at the panel again, because it'll be available, everybody. But if I gave you all of their bios, we wouldn't have time for the panel, because this is such an extraordinary group of people, and I'm just so thrilled to be with them. Anna Ceballos, did I say it right?
That's correct, yeah.
Did I do it right?
You did, yeah.
Okay, all right. Anna is the politics and policy reporter for the Miami Herald. She has covered Florida state government for the Associated Press, Naples Daily News, and the News Service of Florida, and has also covered the cultural battles in Florida, which I am delighted to have her do, because as some of you know, we live there. And her information helps us get from day to day with a little bit of hope. Jonathan Capehart is a member of the Washington Post editorial board. He writes about politics and social issues, is host of the Capehart podcast, and joins our next panelist, I'm going to introduce in a moment, most Friday nights to review the week, primarily in politics. But every now and then they go off on some other things, but mostly it's politics. And David Brooks is New York Times op-ed columnist who writes about politics and social issues. And he also joins Jonathan Capehart on the PBS NewsHour for weekly, mostly political analysis. Every now and then they give us a little something else, which is fine. And finally, Kimberly Crenshaw, American civil rights advocate and a leading scholar of critical race theory. Everybody know what that is? She's a professor at the UCLA School of Law and Columbia Law School, where she specializes in race and gender issues. And finally, Yamiche Alcindor will be our summer upper. Yamiche, of course, is the brilliant host of Washington Week in Review, which she will start out of here tonight and get to Washington so she can do it this week. And one day I will introduce her as so you didn't know this was coming. So this is your challenge. One day she will be the author of a new autobiography. Well, you heard me say one day, but she is working away on it. So we'll look forward to it and hope we'll have it here next year. So, Kimberly, we're going to let the wild rumpus start, okay?
All right.
And I want to start with you because when you hear the phrase culture wars, what does that mean to you? Not least since a lot of the brouhaha revolves around your pioneering work on critical race theory. So just on culture wars, when you hear that, before we get to critical race theory, what comes to your mind when you hear the phrase culture wars, and why does that come to your mind? And we're all going to be pithy and brief.
We're trying to be pithy and brief.
Right.
So pithy and brief, I would say, when I hear culture wars, I hear a misnomer. I hear a framework that tries to put a symmetrical explanation on a deeply asymmetrical situation. When I think culture wars, I think, was the Civil War a culture war? Was the struggle over segregation a culture war? Were the freedom riders engaged in a culture war? Were you involved in a culture war in the history you made? Now, there are those who at the time were willing to say that what we were dealing with was a culture war, two different ways of life, and there was no neutral way of deciding between the two. When I think culture war, I think of the wonderful documentary, The Eyes on the Prize, There was my favorite episode of that was Ain't Scared of Your Jails. And there was an interview with a white woman who was basically saying that civil rights leaders like Diane Nash and others claim to be nonviolent, but they're really very, very violent. They're violent, she said, because they're trying to take away my civil rights. They're trying to take away my right to decide whom I serve and who gets to come into my restaurant. So the idea that the struggle over racial discrimination, the struggle against white supremacy, against the legacy of enslavement is simply a culture war in which there are two sides, to me, is part of the right-wing framing of their effort to push back against the modest progress that we've been able to make. So when I hear culture war, I hear massive resistance against desegregation. I hear people saying that the rights of Black school children to go to integrated schools are basically symmetrical to the rights of white school children not to go to those schools. How are we going to choose between? It's a culture war. And I guess the granddaddy of them all is Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy was a culture argument. They were basically saying that segregation was constitutional because it was symmetrical. Whites couldn't sit in Black cars. Blacks couldn't sit in white cars. And the only thing that one can say about it is that this was necessary for the peace and culture of Southern society. So I am not at all persuaded that what we're in is a culture war. I am persuaded that we're in a war for the soul of the nation. I'm persuaded that we're in a war for democracy. And I'm persuaded that there is no daylight between the war to uphold anti-racism and the war to uphold democracy. I think we're in a democratic war. I don't think we're in a culture war.
Thank you. You put out a lot there, and I'll be back to you in a few minutes. But I want to go next to Jonathan, because I want to ask you the same question, Jonathan. When you hear the phrase culture wars, what does that mean to you? What do you hear?
Well, thank you, Dr. Crenshaw, for your remarks, because I agree with them 100%, which makes my...
Push the mic down closer.
Oh, no, you can hear me, right? Mm-hmm. You can, yeah. I'm just going to add my flavor to it. When I hear culture wars, I hear everything you hear, but I also hear shut up. I hear denial. I hear, I'm tired of hearing about your travails and your issues and your complaints about X, Y, or Z, your civil rights. What about mine? We're seeing that with the so-called, what is it, the Woke Act in Florida, which is now a law. That maybe in the earlier iteration, I don't know if it actually made it into the law, but there was a moment in the bill where it said that anything that adds to the discomfort of a student shouldn't be taught. And my immediate thought was, so what you're saying is you're gonna we gotta whitewash history because white kids are uncomfortable learning about the true history of our country? What about the discomfort of those Black and brown kids having to sit in a classroom where their history is denied, their contributions are denied, and both are erased in the classroom, in history books? And then, you take it even further, and it's not just on race, it's also, if you are anything that isn't white, male, Christian, cisgender, and I'm sure there are a whole lot of other identities, but if you aren't any one of those things, these efforts to push back on history, to claim a culture war, that's aimed at you. I think about LGBTQ Americans in Florida, and particularly in Texas, where I know of one head of a LGBTQ nonprofit. She and her wife, born and raised in Texas, multi-generations, they're raising beautiful twin boys. They are moving out of Texas because it is too dangerous for them to live there. They're moving to Washington. And so when the folks are talking about culture wars, well, who's the victim of this culture war? The people who are hurling the phrase, to my mind, aren't the ones who are the quote unquote victim of these culture wars.
Well, thank you for that. Now, normally on the PBS NewsHour, they have David and and Jonathan so they can disagree. I got a funny feeling. Well, anyway, let me just say, I want to ask you the same question though. What pops into your head when you hear the phrase culture wars? And let me ask you to add to this whether or not this is a new war or just new combatants.
Well, I agree with what Kimberly and Jonathan said. I don't want to echo them. Maybe I'll step back from them.
Don't step back from the mic though.
I will keep my face to the mic. Believe me, when I leave a mic, you can feel the fingernail marks, because I hate being pulled away from a mic. So one of the things that I can add, hopefully, is that this is a global phenomenon. There are culture wars in Poland, in Hungary, in France, in the UK, in country after country, and not just in the West. So let me tell you a story that I hope can encompass why it's happening in all these places. There was a project, I don't know when it started, but it was certainly at a high water mark under Bill Clinton, and I think it went up to Barack Obama. And it was a project to create a certain sort of world. And it was a world with global democracy. And it's a world with intermingled economies. And it was a world that celebrated difference and diversity. It was a world that celebrated individual conscience. I should be able to live the way my conscience tells me I should live. And it celebrated education. And it celebrated cosmopolitanism. And that world was a building for, I don't know, decades, but somewhere all around the world, around 2013, a lot of people said, no, I don't want that world. And some of the reasons they did it were heinous, because they didn't want to live with ethnic diversity and because they were motivated by bigotry. Some of the reasons they said no to that world are comprehensible to me. That world, while just in the world I support, created through globalization massive levels of inequality. And so in all the countries that I've mentioned, the battle lines are drawn often between people who live in metropolitan areas and people in rural areas. That world widened inequality along educational lines. So in all the areas I've mentioned, there's vast gaps in how people with college degrees and people with high school degrees, on average, view, and they're on opposite battle lines. That world, some of the reasons people rejected that world was moral. They said, I don't believe in individual conscience. I don't believe you should be able to choose this. I believe my ultimate authority is not my conscience. My ultimate authority is outside myself. It's my God, it's my community, it's my traditions. And these people say you can't have a common culture if you don't have common morality. Your view of morality is too individualistic. And so some of them I think is heinous, some I understand. And my first response to Donald Trump was he's the wrong answer to the right questions, some of the right questions. And so I want to look across the other people on the other side of the culture war and understand how they see the world. And so I do think it's a comprehensible, in some ways, a comprehensible thing they're standing for. And in some ways, they really have been screwed in the last 20 years. Now, how do you handle that attempt to understand the other side with a lot of the heinous things, of whom I would include Donald Trump? How do you handle trying to be understanding with how to be honest about them? I struggle with that every day. But I do think it's happening around the world for reasons that are cultural, moral, economic, about social location, and about politics. And we're seeing a massive movement that's against the world I think a lot of us dreamed of, which would be a world of liberal democracy, a world of global integration, a world that celebrates diversity and celebrates individual conscience.
Okay, well, I have a lot to come back to as well. which is why you're on the panel along with all these other people. And now I want to go to Anna, because I want to ask you the same question, not least because you've written extensively about this war, cultural war that we're talking about, especially the cultural battles going on in Florida, which isn't unique as it turns out, but it has its own special qualities. And I want to make clear from the start for the audience here that these are not Anna's personal opinions. We attempted to get someone who really believes in some of the things that you all don't believe in, but we were unable to. But one of the things that I guess they figured who would be in the audience, right? No, everybody these days, because COVID is calming down a little bit, everybody's committed. So I'm not saying we couldn't find them, we couldn't get them because they just had other things to do. But we've got Anna, and the reason we do is because she has reported on the people who are pursuing the cultural wars in a different way than what we've heard on the podium so far. And so rather, I want to have you talk about the law, the Stop Woke Act in Florida. Tell us about that and help us understand how that came to be.
Ooh, that's a big one. Yeah, that's it. Governor Ron DeSantis, in Florida at least, seems to be redefining, right, like all these cultural war issues almost daily. And one of the first ones that he really pushed was the quote unquote Stop Woke Act. And it really came in the wake of the pandemic and after he witnessed pretty much all of these nationwide protests and all this reaction to the death of George Floyd and all the emotion really and the outrage and on both sides. And as a Republican governor, he really took it upon himself to do something about it. And what came to fruition ended up being a bill that is titled technically individual freedom. And there's like a set of principles that we as Floridians must abide by according to state law. And those principles instruct employers and instruct or tell them, right, tell classroom teachers that they cannot suggest or assert that someone by the nature of their race or national origin, their sex or gender is inherently bad because of what others of their same race, gender, national origin did in the past. So in essence, it's you can't blame someone for the historical wrongs that a similar group of people did in the past. And a lot of people obviously took that as, you know, what are the historical wrongs that we're talking about? It could be slavery, it could be white privilege was something that was mentioned a lot during the debates. Republican lawmakers who were proposing this didn't really like the fact that children could be reading about anti-racism because, again, it was in the news during all of these protests, right? There was like all these bestseller books that came about, and now it's law. And what we're seeing really is a broad way, because this is not saying you cannot say this and that. It's a broad sentiment as to what you can and cannot say on this broad framework, right? For example, there's something about color blindness. You can't suggest that racial color blindness is racist. So how, and again, this does not just apply to K through 12 schools, it applies to higher ed. So how do you introduce concepts like legal concepts like critical race theory, which are taught in the legal institutions? How do you teach as well diversity trainings and equity trainings? Because it also applies to employers and what the employees can claim is discrimination as stated in state law if they feel like they were told to think a certain way about the way historical wrongs were portrayed and how they felt about it. In a nutshell, that seems to be that law. And right now, actually, breaking news, there is a federal judge that blocked part of that Stop Woke law today, but it's only specific to the employer provision, saying that the judge said that they cannot dictate they cannot mandate an idea. There has to be some conduct that was discriminatory for the state to be able to say that is against the law. You can't just say, just because you think something might be discriminatory, it's against the law, and therefore it was blocked.
But how did the people you were interviewing respond to you? I mean,
Sure.
what were you asking them? How come you taking this position? Or, I mean, how did you pursue this?
So it happened pretty quickly in terms of, when it was proposed, the governor rolled it out, and in Tallahassee, the state capital, as the way it is right now under the leadership of Governor Ron DeSantis, is pretty much whatever he says kind of goes, and Republican leadership doesn't amend much of the language. So a lot of the lawmakers who were really pushing for this piece of legislation were backing the arguments of the governor. So they were pretty much just echoing this in committee. And when pressed for examples, because that's one of the difficult things as a reporter in Florida, it's, you're scrambling to contextualize exactly what they're trying to prevent. What is a problem on the ground that we're trying to address? And there always seems to be none, right? I mean, there's always more of an emotional reaction to creating policy rather than to solve a specific problem. And so that's a lot of the things that lawmakers were saying, like, we don't want this to happen. It's preventative. We don't want kids to be taught to feel that because they are white or black, they were responsible for what their ancestors did. And so it was really framed as a preventative form to protect children from ever having to experiencing it, because they were seeing so much demand from, the protests and everything. And there was so much national discourse about it. And so it was mostly about in that framework that it was promoted.
Right. In the last few days, teachers in Sarasota County, Florida, were told no purchases or donations of any kind of books or reading materials, no scholastic book orders for teachers, no book fairs. Parents can request alternative instructional materials for anything they teach. If we want to read anything to our kids, we have to get it approved in advance. Don't give kids any gifts tied to reading. And the Sarasota librarians can't read aloud with the youngest students, only allowing them to view what's in the state approved books. But what's interesting about this is that Florida is not alone. School districts in 26 states, probably more because that was in April. And we're now in, where are we now, August? 26 states in April had banned or opened investigations into more than 1,000 books. That's according to PEN America. And so this movement is growing. Kimberly, why is that? And where is the pushback that could be effective in bringing about a greater balance or an end to this whole war? Because we are in a war, right? That's what you've all said. It's not me saying it, you said it.
A war against literacy, a war against democracy. So I can answer the first question. The second question, where's the pushback? That's what I've been asking for the last 2 years. Where is the pushback? Is it that people don't really know this is happening? Is it that people have accepted the description of the injury that this legislation is supposedly remedying? Or is it something else? So I'll tell you just a few things that I know. If you want to know how broad and deep this effort to censor information has gone, look on the internet. Look to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund's webpage. They have a lot of information. Look at the African American Policy Forum. We have a map, so you can see all of the states where this kind of legislation is proposed and where it has been passed. It's important to recognize that even beyond state legislation, a lot of local school districts, a lot of local school boards, even in blue states, have taken up this moral panic with the idea that they have to protect children against information about our history, protect children against divisive content, protect children against grappling with the contemporary consequences of that history. We should rise up when we hear that, like the protection of children against divisive concepts. That's what was used against integration. This is the kind of argument that's always been used whenever there is forward momentum with respect to making good on the promises of an equitable, equal society. There's a pushback. And a lot of times the pushback is, so we had what, maybe 20 good years of Reconstruction. Paula Giddens is in the audience. She could tell us something about this. And we had 6 decades of segregation as a consequence of that.
Yeah, because I wanted to ask you, is this new? I mean, is this something new?
There's nothing
We're
new
treating
under
it
the
as if
sun.
it's a new phenomenon.
Well, and that is what the brilliance, and I say that advisedly, of the faction in this society that has always been able to pull the same page out of their history book. Whenever there's forward momentum, there's always anxiety about that. Always a question of, am I losing? And what the other faction has done is use that to say, yes, you are losing. Here is how you're losing, and here's what we want you to do about it. And that is why we have attacks on critical race theory. Most people don't even know what it is.
Well, we're
They
going to
just
talk
know
about
they don't like it.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in a minute because that's a huge one to talk about, critical race theory. And I want to talk to you about that. But I want to ask David, why is it that this just continues? And, you know, I remember when I was growing up, we had the NAACP and we had various organizations that would take on issues that were challenging to people, well, Black people for the most part, but now we say people of color. David, why is there no significant, or is there pushback that is significant?
See, there is significant pushback in the schools. So the Times had a piece today. It was a good piece because one of the things that I've wondered about is there's been all this, you called it a moral panic, not unjustly. Like there's been all this writing, there's so much wokeism in the schools, and occasionally there'll be an example. And then you think, well, we're a big country. How much of it is really going on? And so the Times did a very intelligent thing of going out and talking to social studies teachers. And they did a very smart thing by not just writing down what they said, but showing the video so you can see the human beings. And those human beings struck me as very reasonable and very sensible, trying to talk about the truth about America in the good and bad ways. And they struck me as very inspiring, some of them, in the way they get young people to think. And so we don't cover them because they're not going to wind up on Tucker. But in my view, that's the vast majority of American high school teachers. And they may feel impinged on the laws that are coming down the backs of the books, but they're professionals at their jobs. And I think it's a trick that we do in our profession. We pick one example and then we say, see, it's a wave, but it's one example. Mm. The second thing that's happening on the American right, and you know, in 2015, in 2015, I wrote probably 400 columns. Don't worry, Donald Trump will never get the Republican nomination. That will never happen. And at that moment, I was living in DC, working for the New York Times, and teaching at Yale University. How could I be out of touch with America? And so in the ensuing years, I'm at 35 states a year, talking to left and right. And just, I call it reporting, you would call it going to the bar. But I've noticed this evolution in the people I meet who are pro-Trump and are alarmed about this sort of thing. In 2016, I had a fair deal of sympathy, in part because they would say, you know, okay, how many people who think like me are working at the New York Times? None. How many people who think like me are teaching at Yale University? None. If you tell people they have no voice, they're going to react badly. And I'm afraid a lot of our elite institutions did do that. And so I didn't agree with what they said. God knows I didn't agree with a lot of things they said about Donald Trump. But I got where they were coming from, a place where they felt their voices weren't heard, they were marginalized, and there was this all-powerful establishment who were out to get them who they hated. I had a guy turn around at a baseball game to me, and in the ninth inning, he said, "Are you David Brooks?" And I said, "Yeah," and you expect I would say, like you're writing or something? And he said, "You're an effing a-hole." He started screaming at me. And my son, who's a lot bigger than me, tried to stop him, and he pushed him away. My wife tried to stop him. "Get away from me, woman." And then his hands were shaking. He said, "Look, I'm shaking. I'm in the presence of Satan." And I'm like, whoa, like, where does this come from? I mean, a lot of ballpark beers, but other than that. But I had some sympathy, but then the hatred ratcheted. And now when you talk to some of those same people, it's not about any longer about their root inequalities and some injustices they face. It's about the constant churn of media outrage. And so it's become what Tucker has done. It's become election fraud, which we talk about all the time. And so now it's not about their lives, it's about the perpetuation of the outrage machine from the conflict entrepreneurs. And these laws are responding to, look, it's a problem in America that our educational establishment is more left than it should be. But it's not a problem in America that we're teaching about the truth about American history. But they worked it up into, oh, well, if Tucker says it, if, you know, Mark Levin says it, then that's it. And so it's been interesting to watch people go from knowing something in their heart about their own lives to entering an artificial world of media manipulation. And there's just a lot of that.
I want to talk about that because I think the media are a very important part of this whole discussion about the culture wars, but I want to do that a little bit further down the line. Right now, I want to go to Jonathan. You agree with David? I mean, why do you think there's no real pushback if there isn't? Because there doesn't seem to be. Am I wrong about that? I don't mind you telling me I am.
No, there is some pushback. I mean, I had a couple of, actually I had 3 African-American parents on my Sunday show who were pushing back at the local level against the things that were happening in their school districts.
In what way were they pushing back?
Going to school board meetings, pushing back against the things that the school board was trying to do. I think the problem, though, is it's not at scale, which is why you're asking the question. It's happening, but it's not happening in broad enough a way that it's gotten the attention of the national media that then becomes the snowball that gets everyone talking about it and galvanizes other people. But I want to push back a little bit on what we should do this on the show. Push back on what David
You're
said.
on PBS, by the way, so you know.
So you mentioned in 2015 you wrote 400 columns. Donald Trump will never get the nomination, and you're at the New York Times, Yale, the whole thing. Well, I was at the Washington Post. I went to Carleton, the Harvard of the Midwest. Thank you very much. I live in Washington, D.C. I lived in New York before that. So I know about living in bubbles. And yet, after watching Donald Trump's initial campaign announcement, where not 2 minutes in, he declared that Mexicans were rapists.
That's right.
I started listening, and I started writing columns warning, this guy is destroying American political discourse. We have to push back against this. We have to talk about this. The moment he said what he said about John McCain, how he liked his war heroes who didn't get captured, I did probably one of the most instructive things for me that I did before writing anything, I waited until the next poll came out. If you can go after a war hero, if you can go after someone in the military, a former POW, within the Republican Party, and if your poll numbers go up, that would tell me something. If his poll numbers go down, that would tell me something else. Donald Trump's poll numbers went up after that attack on John McCain, and they kept going up, which was, to me, the alarm bell. The alarm that the Republican Party was heading down a road that it won't be able to turn around. And I kept churning out piece after piece after piece, warning about this guy. Yeah, it's entertaining. I watched the car wreck every time it was on television. I watched all those rallies to see how far he would go, to see what got applause, to hear what got applause. And it was terrifying. And I remember my colleagues on the board, they thought I was being alarmist. They thought, oh, there's no way he'll get the nomination, no way. And yet there I am, African-American, out gay at that point. Was I married then? Yes, married, but no, I wasn't, engaged. But an out gay man listening to this rhetoric through a different lens, watching it and listening to it with a different ear, and trying to warn my fellow Americans that this is dangerous. And it wasn't until Donald Trump attacked a member of the judiciary, I think it was the Cuban-American judge who was presiding over a case against one of Trump's entities. I think it was Trump University. And Trump went after him based on his heritage. And then finally, suddenly, my colleagues around me realized, oh no, he's dangerous. I mean, great, welcome. But by then it was too late. And those were the innocent years back then. Now look where we are. And so if you think I was alarmed in 2015, you can only imagine how I feel right now. At least then, the democratic institutions, small d democratic institutions, were holding firm. They held firm in 2016, throughout his presidency, even 2020. But we're going through issues of wokeness and people talking about critical race theory, and they can't even define it. And now it's just become a catch-all for anything that's racial that annoys them. The big difference now is that those small d democratic institutions are buckling. There are now 6 election-denying Republican nominees for governor: Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Maryland. In 2024, those states will be crucial in determining the presidential election. And in Pennsylvania, it is even more disturbing and terrifying because the governor appoints the Secretary of State. And now we all know what the Secretary of State does in a state and how important that is. And so my alarm with everything from our democratic institutions to what's happening in classrooms to the American people feeling empowered enough to push back against these things that are happening. Because the far right is very good at stunning people who they view are against them. You're engaging in culture wars. Oh my God, you're playing the race card. You're doing something that I don't like. And then lots of people feel like they don't have the power to push back. But it is my hope that given everything that we have seen over these last 6-7 years, and particularly now, that people will rise up and realize that our small d democratic institutions, our democracy as we've defined it as Americans, is at stake. And the only way to save it is if, one, they rise up and exercise their right to vote. I'm not telling anybody how to vote, but if you care about American democracy, you must vote. The decision is yours.
Thank you. I'm saving the discussion about actual critical race theory for a few minutes from now, because that's a huge discussion, and I want you to define it for us. But before we go there, I find it interesting that we haven't been in this discussion very long, and we've already started talking about Donald Trump. And I often turn on the television, and all of the reporters are focusing on Donald Trump. And I'm saying, but wait a minute, isn't there another America out there at the moment? I don't know. So Anna, what are you hearing these days about actually, what are you seeing and what are you doing as a part of the media trying to help overcome these cultural wars? What are you seeing, not just yourself, but other reporters? Are they focused on this at all?
On culture wars, yes. I mean, it's pretty much all consuming as of late because, we do cover the governor. So actions he takes matter. In practice, it's not just words. In practice, people's lives will be affected, right? Whether it be because the state law says you can't or cannot do this, or because of the implications of potential chilling effects that people might think, maybe if I do this, I'll get in trouble, so might as well not do it. And so there is this cloud of anxiety and uncertainty as to how these culture wars, when in practice, how they will be implemented and impacting not just students, but parents, teachers, employers, the LGBT community, parents who want to make choices for them, perhaps. It could go all the way to immigration and how that specific group is being treated as it is framed through the framework of, othering others. Because the whole point of the culture wars I've seen has a pattern, and the pattern is to really just evoke outrage. And whether it is on the right, that they agree with the policy, they're still angry about what they're fighting for. And then on the left, it's the emotional fight of trying to stop it. So the whole point, it's just this exhausting emotional debate constantly in Floridians' minds. And it's not just a state level action, it actually trickles down to everyday life and how people live and do their jobs. And at the end of the day, I mean, I do think that, Trump is mentioned a lot because he really did change the game in that regard. And now Governor Ron DeSantis, we're seeing him try really, really, really hard to make this like a best-selling book for him to kind of piggyback on. And so I don't see this stopping. And so as reporters, we kind of have to cover what they say, cover what they do. We need to do it responsibly, because not just because someone's outraged, it makes it news, right? We have to put, the hardest part is contextualizing what the outrage is about and what is actually happening on the ground. Is there, again, a problem that is being fixed? Is it just preventative? Is it, what is going on and what will be the impact once implemented? And so it's a lot of work, really, because a lot of the times you're dealing with really new issues. Like right now, we're dealing with a gender affirming care debate, and there's a lot of politics being injected into that debate. And sometimes it's really difficult to even discern who is an activist and who is actually a parent and who's actually experiencing what they're arguing about, right? Is it just an opinion, or is it actually something that they're living and that they don't like or that they like? And so trying to clarify that for readers so they can understand at the core what it is that people are fighting and debating about. Because I really do think that this is about emotion. If it was about policy, there would be way more constructive ways of debating these issues, and not just right off the bat starting with pretty much pissing off the other side. And that's pretty much what they're starting at. That's the starting point. And so if they really wanted to change something, because there are some issues that are new and might be concerning, and maybe there should be some regulations, but by just not like closing down the debate and then just implementing the edict at the state level and not really allowing a discussion, a conversation about policy, that's when you realize it's mostly rooted in politics.
Right. Again, I'm saving the big discussion about what is actually critical race theory to the end. So I want to come to you now with a different question. And that is picking up what Anna was talking about. I've been reading that young people and a lot of older people too. When I asked someone the other day, I said, "Did you see such and such and such on the television?" This is a very well-educated person. She said, I don't look at television anymore. I don't read the news anymore. It's just too much.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you reach people, not least because our local news organizations are dying? Local television may still be going, but media, newspapers, local, and so people are just saying, "I'm sick of it. I don't want to hear anymore." What's happening with the media, and what can be done about educating people, especially young people who are only communicating these days through social, Instagram and all of these things that I don't know much about. But anyway, that's another story.
TikTok.
I think that the media are both part of the problem and potentially part of the solution. I have heard now from as many people as you have had who say that they are completely tuning out. They're not reading anymore. They don't even know what the paper of record is. Sorry.
Which one?
And I do think it's partly because there is a sense, first of all, that what counts as deep journalism these days is both-sidism reporting, right? So there's an effort to suppress the vote. How is it covered? Is it covered in terms of these are old strategies that have been always used to suppress voting? Is it being read as the consequence of Shelby versus the Shelby case and several others that basically took apart the Voting Rights Act? Are people connecting the dots between the attack on voting and the attack on the Capitol? Are they even talking about the connection between January 6th and the rise of white supremacy, right? The fact that, the military might in that January 6th insurrection was Oath Keepers. It was Proud Boys. Are people talking about the connection between the notion that the election was stolen and where they're pointing to where the theft happened, namely Black and brown voters? The idea is that that's what's being taken away from them, their right to determine the future. Is the media covering it in the way that a lot of people are experiencing it? And I would say not so much. So why read it?
What do you think, David?
Well, first, as you were speaking, I was thinking about a friend of mine who's a pastor who says, half of my congregation wants me to talk politics all the time, the other half doesn't. And the half that wants me to talk politics are generally the least spiritually healthy people in my church. And a lot of the people who are spiritually healthy are like, I'm just laying low here. I just want to go to church. And I think that's true in American culture in general. That there's a lot of spiritual unhealthiness, and I spend a lot of time in white evangelical circles. And the problem there is that it's no longer a religious community, it's a political community.
Is what?
A political community, and they've made politics their God. And if you're asking politics to give you salvation, to give your life meaning, to give your identity, you're asking more of politics than it should be delivering. And so that's just a spiritual illness. And I do think we try to cover that. I mean, I haul my ass all over the country trying to do it. There are parts of the media that are there for another reason. they're there for ratings and they sense this movement that they can lead, and Tucker Carlson feels fine talking about replacement theory on TV. And so if just one thought, and this is really honored always to be in your presence, Charlene. When you're having an argument with somebody, there's like one extreme where they're civil, and you can feel like Jonathan and I, hopefully, we get together and we can talk to each other.
Yeah.
And hopefully learn from each other. So that's one extreme.
You mean on Friday nights?
On Friday nights. If we met on Tuesday, we'd hate each other, but on Friday. But then at the other extreme, you're in not just an argument, you're in a central war. And some people just need to be beaten. And so the South in 1860, those people just need to be beaten. And so I think, and how you conceive of the level of your disagreement determines what you should do. And so obviously I've gotten a lot closer to thinking our political disagreements are closer to 1860 than I thought 5 years ago. But some people just need to be beaten. But, and here's where your life comes in and a lot of the lives of people in this room, as I read about the civil rights movement in the 60s, those people need to be beaten, the segregationists, but they had to be beaten in a context of love. And somehow how that was done is something I want to learn a lot about. How it was possible to thrust their sin in their faces in a way that exposed it, in a way that was not self-polluting. I think that we all need to learn a lot about how that happened.
Jonathan, you have a comment on what you all are doing wrong? I mean, the media.
The media. Oh, we do lots wrong. We are not nearly as representative in our newsrooms as we should be and as we need to be. Remember, I just told you a story about how I was writing columns, raising alarm about a person lots of people around me thought wasn't going to get the nomination. And I forgot to add that I wasn't the only person of color who was doing the same thing, and yet we weren't listened to. And if you're on social media, you have probably seen memes or things like, we tried to tell y'all, and you didn't listen. And perhaps you should listen now. We in the media could do a better job, one, of listening to the Black and brown or non-white male cisgender reporters in the newsroom, because our experiences as reporters, as journalists, are relevant to the work that we do. We go to these institutions bringing our whole self to the table, and yet we might have editors who don't want to pay attention to that, who don't value that experience that we bring to the table. I would like to think that it's getting better since the murder of George Floyd, but we could still do better. But having said that, ever since the democratization of information, thanks to the internet, we all can pick up our phones, get on our desktops or laptops or whatever you have, your iPad, and we could all Google or search for the same information in ways that I couldn't do, or David couldn't do, when we were young reporters, when the fax machine was the big innovation back in the 80s. But ever since the democratization of information, I strongly believe that news consumers, you here in this church and the folks who are watching, you now have an equal responsibility being a part of this process. You have no idea how many times I have had to yell at people on Twitter for yelling at me for something they said I said, but I didn't say. They said I didn't say, but I did. All because they didn't click the link that I conveniently provided for them. You know, when I write a column, I'm not just slapping down words and saying, here's my opinion. There are hyperlinks. There are things you can click on. You're like, how does he know that? Oh, look, there's a link. Click on the link. And then you can really see, I approach my job with you, the news consumer, in mind. I want you to read what I write. I want you to click those links so that way you can, after you read the column and you go to that dinner party or you go to the cocktail party or you're gonna go argue with Uncle Nate at a dinner, you come armed with information. I am even bastard enough to put in a hyperlink under a word that's a quote that leads to a 20-page report, and you got to read that report to find where I got it. But it's all part of the exercise. And if you don't do that, if I've gone through all that effort and you don't even bother to click the link, then whose fault is that? And I'm not the only reporter who does that. Is that the reporter's fault? Is that the news organization's fault? Or is that your fault as the news consumer? And I always say to people who then get into lengthy arguments with me, I then just send out a general message. If I wrote the way most people write, the way most people read, I'd be fired. I have to write, making sure that what I write is as accurate as possible, and I'm an opinion writer. So, and that is, my argument is as sound as possible. And I implore you as news consumers to start reading things in full, reading with discernment and comprehension, and imploring your kids and grandkids and neighbors and everybody to do the same, because there's so much information out there that people are popping off about, but all they have is a tweet or a headline or something they heard or something that someone said. We all have a responsibility here, especially when our democracy is on the line.
Anna, let me ask you, you see all of these efforts now in practically most fields, including the media, to bring in more people of color. How is that working, and how is it going to be received, do you think? Is it successful so far? And how is it going to be received by people that you've been covering who don't want to hear from these people of color?
My editor is watching, so I need to be careful with what I say. No, I think it's a variety of issues. Yes, diversity is important. In Miami, at the Miami Herald, we have a very large Hispanic population in Miami-Dade County and the communities that we cover. So I've noticed that Spanish speakers are very valuable, specifically for our community, right? And understanding, so you can not just know what they're saying, but understand the culture, understand the level of comfort that they might not have when they're being interviewed by another person who does not have that shared experience, right? Because sometimes a lot of our job as reporters is to make people want to tell us their stories and their perspectives. It's not just forcing them to just, word vomit whatever we want them to say. It's really understanding, and in one-on-one conversations, having a human moment and then putting it on paper, and to inform people in the community what others who they might not interact with are thinking. And in politics, that is so important at this moment in time, because I think the divisiveness, all these culture wars are so emblematic of no one is talking to one another. And I just don't know how we repair that without listening to one another. And as reporters, we do need to have diversity in a newsroom that is representative of whatever community at the local level, whatever community you're covering, the national level, what the country looks like. And without that, I just don't know how different perspectives can be not only told and broadcast, but understood. And I think it's so important in this moment in time to just have more people with diverse opinions. And I think our paper has been able to do a lot of recruiting to meet those goals. But I mean, we're a shrinking newsroom, and that's another dynamic that we need to address, because sometimes a small staff all we will be able to do is cover the breaking news and go, and then there's more breaking news, so you don't get to go back and talk to the people and see what happened and understand what is going on the ground, because they're already being told to cover the next press conference and you have to drive 2 hours. And so it's both diversity, it's both quantity of reporters, and I think it's also willingness to spend the time and want to do a good job as a reporter and offering different perspectives and different statistics that I'm like, oh, I wonder if they're going to raise this question. Maybe we should bring up both points or bring out more data that could explain what might be coming to their minds and what doubts might be arising from this specific issue, and just doing more homework, because there is so much disinformation out there that it's more work as of late.
Right. I want to save some time for our audience, but I also want to come back to Kimberly because the, what shall I say, the hidden factor in the room is critical race theory. And it's so misunderstood from everything that I read. Most people don't get it. They don't know what it is. And so why don't you briefly tell us what is critical race theory and why it is important to teach it, and at what point, because this is the other thing I'm seeing, there's so much misinformation about where this thing is taught. Hope you don't mind me calling critical race theory a thing. But anyway, tell me a little bit about that. And then what we're going to do is go to Yamiche, who's going to summarize some of the things we've talked about. And then we're going to ask our audience for questions. So you can start thinking about it, and we'll have, how long, Skip, would we have? We have until 7. So instead of doing a college lecture on critical race theory, just give us the main points of what it is and where people are getting it wrong.
Well, that's the part, that's the long part. So I'm glad you said a thing, because actually critical race theory is not a thing. It is a practice. It is a way of reading. It's a prism. It is a modality. So critical race theory traditionally is a way of understanding why, after 5 decades since formalized segregation collapse, there's still predictable patterns of racial inequality. And those predictable patterns of racial inequality get produced in neutral ways in institutions that claim to be colorblind and race neutral. So it is effectively a way of saying there is still massive amounts of inequality across this society. It is not the product of unequal people. It is the product of institutions that have yet to reform themselves and rid themselves of some of the practices that were established when we weren't allowed to be in those institutions. Now that's sort of the classic definition of critical race theory. It's what a whole generation of post-civil rights young people went to law schools and other departments to try to study. But the important thing that I want to leave folks here with is, even though you have not probably heard of critical race theory until last year, although it's been around for 30 years, you practice critical race theory every day if you're a person of color. You practice critical race theory every time you know and act on your recognition that this is not a colorblind world. You practice critical race theory every time you see the police sirens in your rearview mirror and you put your hands in the 10 and 2 o'clock position. You're practicing critical race theory. Every time we give our children the talk, and we must, we are practicing critical race theory. Every time we try to refinance our home and we realize that we need to take our Black pictures down and our Black art off the wall and bring some white people in to sell that for us, we are practicing critical race theory. The time you're sitting in that meeting and you say something and it goes over like a lead balloon, and the white guy next to you says the same thing 5 minutes later, and it's like that's the best thing they've ever heard, and you go, you are practicing critical race theory. So the point is that these are the lived realities that we have used to survive in a world that was not made along the myth of equality and colorblindness. It was made, and it is still a society it's a post-slave society. It's not the same as a society that never has had slavery. It's not the same as a society that didn't have a Supreme Court that said Black people will never be part of this republic because they were enslavable people. That was once part of the law. So critical race theory is basically a way of saying, yes, the collapse of white supremacy was one step in a long journey. And that journey is one that each generation has to take using the wisdom that has been passed down to us. So whenever you recognize that what the other side is trying to say is that your race consciousness comes against color blindness, they're basically calling you a critical race theorist. And at this point, you should say, yes, I am, because that's how we survived. And that is how this democracy is going to survive. We cannot survive thinking that the attack on democracy and the attack on anti-racism are separate things. They are one and the same right now. And to save one, we have to save the other.
What's interesting about the argument about critical race theory is that young children cannot absorb this. Now, what I would like you to do is talk about where critical race theory is taught, because I continue to hear that people are opposed to it being taught to their children in elementary school and their children in high school, but that's not where it's taught. Where is it taught?
You know what? I have to say that I think that was a bad tactical move for a lot of people when the attack on critical race theory started. It started with President Trump issuing an executive order.
Former President
Trump issuing that order, essentially saying that critical race theory, along with an entire apparatus of anti-racist ideas, the 1619 Project, implicit bias, structural racism, intersectionality, systemic racism, they put it all in one container and said all of it was un-American, all of it was vicious, all of it was divisive, all of it was designed to make people feel bad and could not be done. And I think the mistake was that some of us thought, oh, you're really talking about critical race theory, like the course I teach about Plessy versus Ferguson and the civil rights cases and Brown versus Board of Education. Well, no, that exact course is not being taught, but that's not what they were going after. They were going after anti-racism. They were going after the history of anti-racism. So if you want to see what they're going after, look at what they're banning. They banned the book on Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges, her story of integrating New Orleans schools at 6 years old. They would ban yours. Right?
Wait, I got one coming up. Don't talk about it.
And so the Moms of Liberty went after Martin Luther King, went after the March on Washington, because they said that the picture of the police dogs in Selma was inappropriate for children. So here's what I think is really going on. I think a lot of people were shocked about how many people, white people, came out during the summer of 2020. The majority of those people out there were actually white. 50 states in the union had massive protests. And a lot of people, I think, looked at that and thought they've jumped to the other side. How did that happen? It must be happening in the schools. So we've got to go figure out what they are learning that makes them so sympathetic to anti-racism that they're putting their bodies out there to support racial equity. So they're going after not just critical race theory, they're going after all of these ideas because they want to make sure that this next generation does not pick up the cause of racial justice, does not defend the idea that this country is made for everybody. And they want to make sure that they don't look at them and their grandparents and say, well, where were you, mom and dad? Where were you, grandma and grandpa? So that whole part in these pieces of legislation that says nothing that makes people feel bad. Actually, they're telling us what they're worried about. They're telling us that they feel guilty. They're telling us that they don't want their kids to look at them in a certain way. So the best way to do it, get rid of Martin Luther King, get rid of Ruby Bridges, get rid of Ta-Nehisi Coates. The list of all the books, Skip even told me one of his books was banned in Texas, right? So if you're gonna ban Skip Gates, then what are you after? You wanna shut it all down. And that's effectively what it is. It's why we need to fight this without, oh, we don't know what critical race theory is. You know what? They don't know what it is either. They just know they don't like it. It's about anti-racism and they need to shut it down.
David, do you have any thoughts on critical race theory?
You know, the
Or
definition
should
of
I move you further down the?
the definition of a pundit is someone who studies brain chemistry for 30 minutes and then lectures neuroscientists on how to perform brain surgery. I'm not stupid enough to give my view of critical race theory with Kimberly Crenshaw sitting right here. That's it.
That was it. I heard that.
I will say, as you were speaking, though, the one thing that struck me is that the tack you took was different than the tack a lot of other people took, which you alluded to. What you said, it's the consciousness people live in every day. And a lot of other people said, oh, it's some abstruse legal thing. It's only in law schools. These were two different tacks people took.
Jonathan, one of the other things that is under attack is this phrase systemic racism. People don't seem, from my perspective, don't seem to understand what it means. Can you talk about that just a little bit? What is involved in systemic racism? I mean, in a few minutes.
Wait, a few minutes. If this were a paper, I would write, see Kimberly Crenshaw. I mean, Dr. Crenshaw explained it all. What systemic racism is and all the examples that you gave, structural racism. So there, I can't even gild this lily. I think Dr. Crenshaw did answer that question.
Yeah, but if you look at some of the statistics, which I think are very important, that are included in systemic racism, that show you over time the discrimination against people of color.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that what really systemic racism is? And when you look at the disproportionate effect on people of color of just about everything you can think of.
Right. And in fact, in the New York
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, in fact, in the New York Times today, we saw yet again a story involving a Black couple trying to get their home appraised.
Right.
If I remember right, when they went for the appraisal, the Black couple, it was appraised at $300-something thousand, $400-something thousand. A white couple then goes to get the same house appraised. It's appraised at $720,000. Systemic racism. I mean, that is, and that's in the paper today, or at least online. Yep. Today. So that is a very good example. That is a prime example. We could talk about, the number of, African Americans going for job interviews. Who gets an interview and who doesn't depends on their name, their first name. Mm-hmm. There are all sorts of other examples. Although, I mean, I haven't, thanks to Uber or rideshare, hailed a cab lately. But that, way back when, that was an example of systemic racism. When I lived in New York City, and you've seen how I dress, so I just imagine this outfit with an LL Bean tote bag. Trying to get to work. I raised my hand to get a cab. No one would stop. Not even the Black cab drivers would stop. And I got so angry. I was like, what do you have to be afraid of? I'm carrying an LL Bean tote bag. Come on. And in New York City, I devised this system. I never caught a cab on an uptown avenue, even if I were going downtown. If I were with white friends, some I would have to instruct, you have to go get the cab.
Absolutely.
Other white friends had the presence of mind to know and would race out ahead and get the cab. I had to instruct one of these friends a while back. He reminded me of this Italian journalist in New York. And he told me recently, he'll never forget when we left this gay journalist event and we went to the corner and I asked him to get the cab. And he could not understand why. And then I explained to him, and to me, is my lived experience. So I forgot about it. But he told me, and again, recently, that he never forgot that. And it was an instructive moment for him as an Italian in the United States and in New York City, which has the reputation of being this big liberal mecca. And yet every systemic racist thing that we could talk about on this stage happens there as it happens throughout this country. The only thing that I will say that gives me hope is that millions more people, because of the murder of George Floyd, now understand what many of us have been saying for generations.
Thank you. I want to go to the audience in a minute, but I just have one more question, and that is about the threats that are coming against young people, including, I just read, I think it was in the paper yesterday or day before, that there was a Nazi kid, a kid who practiced Nazism in Boston, I think it was, who has been harassed online, just like a lot of the young Black people who are trying to get into their own, things that they should be getting and aren't. And they communicate through social media, and yet that's easy to pick up by people who disagree with them. And so they're being challenged, including one guy who said, "Reading while incarcerated saved me," a former prisoner. So why are prisons banning books? And so, it's everywhere. And the young people, especially now, because I don't know if they read you, David, or they read you, Jonathan, in the Times and in the Post, and Hannah, in your newspapers, but they are communicating. And yet when they do communicate, they get threatened and challenged. How do we deal with that? And let's make it quick, because I want to get a couple of questions from the audience, and also we'll conclude this part of the program with Yamiche, and then we'll go to the audience. But right now, I want that answer.
Everyone's looking at me.
Whoever wants to take it.
So are you saying, like, why are young people being so bullied or harassed online? Is that the question?
Sorry.
What's the question exactly?
The question is, how do you deal with the threats that come to the young people who are communicating through social media? And that's not just the ones on the liberal side, because as I said, I read about this young kid who's a Nazi, but he also got threatened. And are you going to accept that and not, accept?
Yeah.
I don't know, Anna, but I just think
Get a little closer.
the answer to that question is really, it's tough. I think that's part of the conversation we're having as a nation right now, in terms of, there's freedom of speech, but how much speech, what kind of speech? I feel for the Nazi kid getting harassed, but come on. I'm not for bullying. I just want to say that. But come on. And that's why, that's why this is such, the question you pose is difficult. I think we have to be vigilant about the harassment and the bullying and the threats, whether it's young school children or FBI agents trying to uphold the rule of law in this country against the former president of the United States, who took top secret documents and was supposed to take. It is a problem, these threats at all levels of our society right now. And the question in the way you posed it, Charlene, is, to my mind, exposes how difficult it is, for me anyway, to answer that question.
Yeah. Could
David?
I take a sip? So we've talked a lot of problems in this country. Not one of them is not made worse by the mental health crisis in this country. And so the 58% rise in teen suicide, 30% rise in depression, 40% or 54% of Americans say no one knows them well. The number of Americans who say I have no close personal friends has quadrupled over the last couple decades. It's just a reign of sadness. And sad people turn mean some of the time because they feel they're not seen and that it's an injustice, and it is an injustice. And they turn, some of them, vicious. And they shoot up places and they spread hate online. And I don't know what to do about this weird crisis of connection that we've been going through for 20 or 30 years. And it's what leads, I think, what contributes to some kid joining the Nazi party because the Nazis say you belong. It is just an underlying reality that inflames everything else.
And just to add to that, I recently went to an education writers conference, and a lot of the issues that were going on in schools were brought to light. And it was surprising when I learned that one of the main concerns teachers have right now is student conduct in the classroom, almost just as much as these culture wars and school safety with gun violence. But it was also just unruly students and just not knowing how to just deal with them. So it's not just online in terms of harassment, it's also in person. And I think it goes along the lines of, mental health and just the noise, right, that is it's also consuming in our society right now, whether it be the news, whether it be the divisiveness in politics, whether it be, the villainizing groups of people and pitting them against one another. I do think that there's an impact in how a younger generation is consuming that news and then having a worldview. So it was something that teachers brought to light a lot, and they're still trying to figure it out.
Okay,
So-
thank you. Very quickly, and then we go to Yamiche.
I'll add a bit of a discordant note, I guess. I completely agree that we have a mental health crisis in the country. And that's also not to say that we don't have a racism crisis in the country. So when I think about Nazism, the internet, I think about Charleston. I think about Mother Emanuel. I think about Buffalo. I think that we have to ask the question. There are a lot of people who are feeling isolated in this country. There are a lot of people feeling like they haven't been heard. There are a lot of people whose socioeconomic status has deteriorated over their lifetime, but there are not a lot of people who are going out and killing people of a different race because of that. So we can't substitute a conversation for the fact that we are now in our lifetimes. There are those of us who heard stories about what it was like to live knowing that you might be killed because you are Black. We spent years thinking that we were no longer that kind of society. And now we literally have to think about whether you'll get killed praying while Black or shopping while Black or just daring to exist while Black. This is a reality of this country now that racial and political violence is once again something that we have to think about. Who thought that was going to happen again? So I want to be able to think both about the mental health crisis, but I don't want that to be a substitute for the fact that now virulent racism is shaping the consciousness of children who were born in the 21st century with ideas that stretch all the way back to the 16th century. We've got to figure out how that happened and what to do about it. Yeah.
Can I just, to be clear, I didn't at any point say it was a substitute for
No.
racism. I said it made everything else worse.
I didn't think you did, but you also know that a lot of people cover this as a mental health crisis, full stop. And we can't have.
I agree.
Yeah, just very quickly, I just read about a young boy, a young Black man who said that he couldn't go out of the house anymore. He stayed in the house all the time, and he had pains in his stomach, and he just couldn't function anymore. And I was pretty shocked about that. But it was reported, so I guess it's a true story and a sad one at that. All right, thank you all for this. We'll come back in a few minutes, but let's go to Yamiche before we end. When Yamiche finishes, if you have any questions, there are microphones on that side, in the center, and on that side. So if you want to, she's going to talk for about 5 or 6 minutes as she's been assigned. And then you can, whoever has a question, and let's be, as the panel has been, with your questions, pithy and brief. Yamiche.
When Charlene tells you to talk for 5 or 6 minutes, you start a timer when you start talking so that you know what to do. Well, thank you all for being here, for spending this time, not at the beach, but with us. Thank you, of course, to the panel for all of your insightful words. I started thinking about, as I was tasked with summarizing this and thinking about what culture wars were, I started thinking, is it a hyperbolic term, the word culture wars? It seems so violent, so dangerous, so scary. And then I went and Googled Charlene and went and looked at those pictures of you walking into the University of Georgia and remembered that Charlene has walked through the culture war. It is absolutely a war. It is absolutely violent. It brings to mind the images of Buffalo and of Mother Emanuel and of the synagogue in Pennsylvania where people were killed, and in the attacks that we see on our Asian American brothers and sisters. It is absolutely a culture war that has to be covered as such. It has to also be covered as Kimberly smartly said, a war on democracy, a war on where we are as a country. I think when I think about sort of how the media plays a role in this culture war and how we cover it, I have to tell you a quick story, which will be brief and pithy, I promise, Charlene. But I picture me in 2016. I'm covering former President Trump, then candidate Donald Trump, and I'm in Wisconsin, and I set out to do a story about healthcare. And I went to this suburb in Wisconsin that was about 97% white. And I started talking to people, especially one man, about healthcare, thinking that part of the appeal of then candidate Trump was about healthcare and his policies that in some ways were more progressive than Hillary Clinton in terms of talking about Medicare for all. And in interviewing this man, I started hearing him say over and over again, people think I'm racist. And at some point as a reporter, I thought, well, why am I telling him what the story is? Why don't I let him tell me what the story is? I said, sir, why do people think you're racist? And he told me, look at you, a Black woman working for the New York Times. How could you ever be here if it wasn't for affirmative action? And by the way, Black women like you, all they want to do is get impregnated by Black men who will leave you, and then the government and us will have to take care of your children. And I recall that story because when I sent the quotes to the New York Times, they said, are you sure he told you this? And I said, yes, he told me this. And it was a reminder to me that as someone who enjoys covering race, who thinks covering race is one of the most important beats in America, and it penetrates everything that we do from politics to economics to healthcare to education, even in that moment, I was not listening to the story at first and wanting to tell me that this man really focused on Donald Trump because he liked his healthcare plan. And he was telling me, no, the reason why I like Donald Trump is because he's going to make my town that's 97% white stay that way. And I don't want to see Black faces, he told me, in my union shop. So to me, the story of covering this and where we go next, which is what Charlene told me I should also be talking about, is we should continue to cover the story that is in front of us. We should continue to cover the ugly truths of America. We should continue to look at 2016 and 2020 and 2024 for what they are, which is really, in some ways, a battle for the very existence of America. We are looking at the ideals of America, who can have the American dream, what does that really look like? What kind of country do we want to be? These are the big, hard, challenging questions that not just reporters are grappling with, but scientists are grappling with, Congress is grappling with, very Americans who are tasked with taking in the news are grappling with. And I think about the fact that Jonathan in particular talked about sort of we all have this responsibility in news. I was raised by Haitian immigrants who came here to America believing all the ideals that we tell everyone around the world. And I am in some ways my ancestors' wildest dreams. I am also, though, grappling with the nightmares that they did not realize that this nation had. And those nightmares entail the responsibility of us to, in some ways, look at the fact that as Americans, we are biased because we are thinking, most of us, that we are living in an exceptional country, a country that is better than, in most cases, better prepared, better resourced. That is the bias that a lot of American journalists, that a lot of Americans come to this with. So I implore you all to also, as you're looking at your media landscape and not taking in for misinformation, to also look at the way that the international press covers America. Read the BBC, read France 24, which is France 24. Read the way that they respond to Americans and look at our society and realize that we are not exceptional, that the issues that we are dealing with, the issues of our democracy, that they are issues that other countries have grappled with, and some of them have lost, unfortunately. And that has led to dictatorship and all sorts of scary endings that Americans, likely myself included, often think that we are somewhat shielded and protected from, when in fact we are not. I think about Kimberly talking about the soul of this nation and America having always had this sort of tug and pull, push and pull. I think about the fact that I used to think that we were living almost through Reconstruction, but I think we might be living through something even worse. Right? We all sort of know what's right and wrong. We all sort of know what history has done once, yet here we are again after the inflection point, the change summer of 2020, where we as a nation said we did not want to see Black people, but really anyone, kneeled on the neck for 9 minutes and 25 seconds from police officers. We sort of all across the political landscape said that was not something we want. And now we're at a point where there's a complete backlash to that idea. And there are people who do not want to talk about race because it's no longer avant-garde. It's no longer trendy. It's no longer the thing that makes people comfortable to talk about. But I, in some ways, have to, again, employ the media and ourselves to really confront those things and say, yeah, it's ugly and it's uncomfortable, but we have to do them. I also just want to end with this. I think all of this, because I spent a lot of time sitting on the porch of Charlene, but also spending a lot of time with Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is the creator of 1619, in the week that I was here. An incredible woman who challenged our nation to look at the consequences and the tentacles of slavery in a new way. And I think that as we think about grappling with these questions, we cannot for a second think that we are not living with the consequences of slavery every single day in every single beat. So part of the responsibility that we all have is to look at 1619, because there is this debate going on about what 1619 was, and to really say 1619 was just saying, remember that who your founders were, remember what this country was, remember what slavery did to all of us, and remember the consequences that we're all dealing with. So with that, I will close because it's now been 6 minutes. So I will leave it to Charlene, but I want to say thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shamish. That was amazing. I think everybody would agree. I don't have any clue how you managed to do it, except you've been my little sister for a long time. Anyway, questions, and again, let's be pithy and brief. Tell us who you are, and we have a question. Are you by the mic?
Yes.
Speak right into it.
Thank you to all the panelists. My name is Keith Harrison. I'm a professor at UCF and a Nasir Jones Hutchins Hip Hop Fellow alumnus. My question is to Professor Crenshaw. 17 years ago, you gave the keynote at UCLA's affirmative action panel, and I'm going to tweak the question then, which I asked is, how do we create a win-win in allyship? How might we utilize your pioneering work on intersectionality to build solid collaborations with white Americans, the ones not in this room, in this church, and get them to see allyship as a win-win versus a zero-sum game. And I hope you'll sign one of your books later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, very briefly.
He's telling me I have to be brief. I'm going to say two things. Number one, recognizing that affirmative action is not a zero-sum game. It's not preferential treatment. It's not reverse discrimination. It is actually equal opportunity. It is actually the process of remaking higher education in a way that opens the doors for those for whom the criteria were not meant to determine the likelihood that they would be successful in those institutions. It's also important to recognize affirmative action is on the Supreme Court docket this year. It is possible, probable, that affirmative action is going to be over. And so the question that we're going to have to raise is, what are we going to do instead of it? Because the reason we need it is because the criteria that have been used are not criteria that equally predict the success of people of color. So our moment will be what our colleagues are going to be willing to do. And I can tell you, as an institution that lost affirmative action, many times they go, oh, too bad. We got to be prepared now. No, it can't be too bad. You cannot continue to use these same measures to admit people and be happy with the institution that is as segregated as it was in the late 1960s.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Yes, sir?
Hello, my name is Willie Cogdell. I enjoy this forum. Doctor, I really enjoy you. Jonathan, I'm gonna start reading your articles. David. But truly, Dr. Martin Luther King said, without a protest, there would be no change. Okay, I'm looking for solutions. I've been to the March on Washington that we just had with Martin Luther King Jr. His daughter spoke, his little daughter, and they said there 55 years ago, which was the anniversary, we were talking about the same thing. We come back 3 more years, we're gonna be talking about the same thing. I want to know, what can we do about solutions? What happened with George Floyd? Did you see the protests? Did you see the amount of people that came together? White, black, Puerto Rican, Asian, everybody came together, and it was a change. It made a difference. So what's going to change systemic racism and discrimination in this world today? And Dave, spiritually, we have to talk about this stuff in the church. Okay, and then what happened with the
you have a question, and we have someone who can answer it.
The non-violent movement was all push on faith. Okay, what they believed in.
Solution.
So here, what I'm saying, I'm gonna stop.
I think
I'm gonna stop. What I'm saying, though, solution. We need solution with the nonviolent. Love casts out hate. Hate can't cast out hate. So you say you want to learn how to love. Is faith. Faith comes by hearing the word of God. The more you hear that word, the more you get that faith.
I'm sorry,
all right?
but you have to cut it out.
And what happened was during this, people died. People died during the what's that? So we got to be willing to stand for what we believe. We need solutions. This talk is good, but we need solutions.
Okay, and let me just take that other question over there, because I think we're just gonna be about 3 more minutes, and I want to be able to get the next question here very brief, and I'll take yours very brief, and then we gotta say goodnight.
So my name is Phyllis Stone. I'm from Somerset, New Jersey. And my question is, it's related in some ways, where do you think the religious media is failing? Or is it that people aren't going to church anymore? That's one thing. But where do you feel that the religious media is failing in terms of being able to at least send the right messages out and get into people's heads and spirits and hearts?
Okay, now you all have taken notes on the question, so I'm going to take one more over here, and then we'll have 3 questions that we need to get. And this lady, if you can make it real quick, because Skip will kill me. Well, you won't kill me, but he may punish me. Okay. Let's get this. You finish your question? Okay, and you?
Curtis Valentine, professor at the University of Maryland, but also the founder of realmenteach.com. And we talk about diversity in the newsroom. Only 2% of teachers are Black men. What is your message, particularly for those who are listening to how teachers are being treated? What is your message to young high school students? Why should they become teachers, particularly Black and brown men?
Okay, and then there's one last question here. I hope you all have questions that you want to answer, because we're going to have to do them all at one time. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Joyce Ladner, a sociologist. Hi, Charlene. but when I was in college, I was in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We organized, and we still advocate organizing from day to day instead of mobilizing large numbers of people. We also have to go into the white community and organize as well. I want to know if you guys will begin to cover people who are really trying to go block by block, as we did in the South back in the 60s. And really, it was a pitched battle then, and it will be one now. But SNCC did it. And I believe, just as we were the Green Berets of the movement, I think a lot of lessons could be learned from what happened in the 60s and how we did it.
Thank you. All right, now we have about, and one more question over here. Huh? I don't think we can carry can we carry it up there? If I don't let him answer the question, I can't go home. James Lowry, make it brief.
Make it brief. Brilliant panel. And I've been on the vineyard about 2 days. And the first day I arrived, I went to the history makers. And Jonathan, you were the host and the moderator. And we talked about systematic racism for those corporate leaders. We talked about systematic racism for the entrepreneurs. The last day and a half, I've been with the Economic Forum, which is ELC and others, and McKinsey. McKinsey brilliantly presented all the facts that we dealt with in terms of systematic racism, where we are and where we should go. I guess the question I would ask, because many of the people I was there today, have the same fears that were expressed on this panel. They're fearful of what's coming up in November. They're fearful of what might happen 2 years from now. They're feeling very uncomfortable. But I think the commitment coming in from their point of view is that we have to create wealth. We have to invest in one another. We have to deal with the fact we are in a free enterprise system, but it's a capitalistic system. Okay, so the question is, how can we, in the brilliance of the people here, projecting what they do so well, work with those brilliant people over there who are creating wealth and want to create more wealth to support you against enemies who don't want us to succeed?
Okay, we'll have you on the panel next year. Now, everybody, we are running a little bit behind, so if you could address whichever of the questions you heard briefly so that I don't get fired.
All right, I'll jump in since we're running out of time. I want to answer Mr. Caudell, if I got your last name right. You asked for a solution. What can be done? Vote. You have an opportunity. The 2022 midterm elections is the first round. The 2024 presidential election is the second round. Folks if you are upset about what's happening now and that we're refighting the battles of old, although those battles have never really fully been won, then you must vote, and then you must vote for the people who will vote for change. This is a marathon, not a sprint, as we know. But then the voters must hold those people accountable once they're in office. So that is the simple solution that I can give. Vote. It is not a powerless exercise. It is the one superpower we have as Americans.
Thank you. I mailed mine this morning. Anybody else want to answer any of the questions? David?
I'll try to end on a hopeful note. I'll just tell you the most hopeful thing that's happened to me in the last 5 years. I co-founded an organization called Weave, the Social Fabric Project. And it's based on the idea that we're riven by distrust, but they're all in communities all around the country. There are people who are building trust by being active in their communities. And what we did, we take people, we help give support financially and support by asking them to tell their stories. People like a woman named Keishel Daniels, who runs Sisters of Watts, a community organization in Watts. A woman named Aisha Butler, who runs Rage in Englewood in Chicago. And the most hopeful people I've met understand that the answers to problems of neighborhoods live in the neighborhoods. And that if we can do more, and the money they have is pathetically small, and the amount of attention we give them is pathetically weak. And so aside from voting, there has to be top down, but there also has to be bottom up renaissance. There's a phrase from the book of Job, as the sparks fly upward. And just to be around these people over the last 5 years has been incredibly inspiring. At the time when I come back to Washington at the end of the week to get the press to go out in the middle of the week to get inspired.
Thank you. And I've interviewed you on that program, so I will give a ditto on it. Anna, very quickly, briefly, if you have. If you don't, that's fine too.
To your question about teacher recruitment, there has been a lot of concern that there's not enough schools graduating enough teachers as it is, right? So with that specific question that you had, I mean, I have talked to veteran teachers who have mentored young teachers who are just coming into the industry, and they're pretty much telling them, you know, your blood has to be in this. Like, it's almost like a vocation. So I mean, I don't know if that's a solution, but they're portraying this as a really tough industry to be in it right now. And if there's people who are engaged in the community, maybe you approach conversation and see if that's something that they would consider doing. And just, you know, it's not a solution, I guess, but it is a true concern that is going on, and it's going, and a lot of veteran teachers are thinking about it right now too.
Thank you. Kimberly?
So I'm going to build on what Jonathan said. In addition to read, speak is what they're trying to do is shut us up. We've been through this before. There used to be a time where you couldn't even testify against white people. That's essentially what we're dealing with right now. So telling our stories, passing them on to our children, finding out what's going on in the school district. Don't allow the only parents that school boards hear from to be the people who are crazy angry about something that they have no idea what they're talking about. They need to hear from us as well. We need to recognize that the ultimate goal here is an attack on public institutions, because they're democratizing institutions. They want to take out public schools. They want to take out higher education. The next step in this actually is to take this, you can't talk about a racial history, you can't talk about these ideas in higher education, and you have to ask yourself why. The main reason why is that the only group of white people who have been resistant to Trumpism is college-educated white folk. They're not going to let that continue. So we have to be vigilant about where we put our bodies, what we learn about, how we democratize education. So here's the two things I suggest. Number one, African American Policy Forum has democratized education through critical race theory summer school. We make it open and available to anyone who wants to know, what is this stuff about critical race theory about and why it should matter to me. So you can find it on the website, 120 classes about critical race theory. And if Skip lets me say this, on Monday, if you really want to know how critical race theory is shaping the future and how to use it as a tool to reclaim our democracy, we'll be talking about it at 5 p.m. with Keith Ellison, Barbara Arnwine, Pat Williams and Terrence Woodbury, who's telling people actually there is a demand for these ideas, and a lot of voters are upset that our elected officials are not standing up and they're pivoting away. So if you want to hear more about what's happening on the ground, join us there, Union Chapel, 5 o'clock on Monday.
Thank you. And we've already heard from Yamiche, unless you have a quick something else to say, because you were absolutely wonderful and we thank you. And I want to leave you with something I grew up with that I think is still relevant. Did I say relevant? I meant relevant. We got to keep on keeping on.
Yes.
We got to march on till victory is won. Thank you.